In the previous video, we left the work at the end of the majestic introduction, when the night wind was just about to transport us into a different world. Let us listen to it again and see where it is taking us. As we can see, the first thing we come across is another version of the initial launching pad motif of the sonata. You will soon come to understand the importance of this motif as a structural device. For now, you can feel that after the brooding feeling of the previous section, we immediately get a sense of freedom, as if the music was finally allowed outdoor after a period of confinement. Without further ado, finally comes the long-awaited first theme. Let us listen to it. Many things to comment on here. This first theme is something quite unique. As I mentioned in the previous video, this first movement of the Night Wind Sonata is one of the longest movements ever written in 5 beats a bar. And it is always something of a tour de force for a composer to write melodically in 5 without it sounding forced or clumsy. Of course, the other movement which springs to mind is the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Pathetic Symphony. One has to understand that a bar of 5 beats doesn't really exist as such. The brain will automatically and subconsciously decompose it. Tchaikovsky went for the less intuitive 2 plus 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Medtner tends to stick for the 3 plus 2 for most, if not all of the time. The spirit of the theme is a certain wild, unbounded energy, sometimes more rhythmic, as in the opening figure, or more lyrical in the phrase that follows. Then happens something which is going to be a strong feature of the movement, if not of the whole piece. That is repetition of the material. In the Night Wind Sonata, we will see that much of the material tends to be presented twice, usually with variations. It is easy to understand why. It stretches the structure and helps to give it the proportion necessary to create a work of some magnitude. It might also help us to retain the themes in our memory, which in a work of that scale, where themes tend to have far-reaching implications, can be helpful. The problems it may create are equally obvious. It might feel to us that Medtner is compensating for a certain lack of invention and going for the easy or the lazy way. And indeed, in this sonata, we will find a little of both. Though I do make a claim for the work to be a masterpiece, I do not pretend it is flawless. And I do want to point out the weaknesses in the design as well as the strengths. I think it is useful to understand that composing is a craft and that composers are human. Even the greatest of them make mistakes, and the greatest works are not necessarily the ones which are mistake-free. In a similar way that the greatest men usually have weaknesses which can be quite pronounced and which always baffle people who would like to be able to feel secure in the admiration they bestow onto them. But life and music is rarely so black and white. In the case of the theme we are discussing, the repetition actually works very well, in large part because Medtner introduces an element of imitation which is typical of his language and which goes some ways toward explaining his success as a composer of large-scale works. To understand what I mean, there is no better way than to illustrate it. If I play you this part of the theme in its second occurrence, what you will most likely hear is, like the first time round, a very good melody. But Medtner's mind is quintessentially contrapuntal, and if you try to unpack the accompaniment, you will notice the following. The ascending figure of the melody is this time accompanied by its mirroring form. Now, this descending form of the melody starts spreading like throughout the texture, like mushrooms after the rain. And if we try to play the same melody, bearing this in mind, we may make it sound more like this. Which is quite different. You may remember what I said in the first episode of this series about the problem of working with overly developed themes when building a large architecture. Here Medtner is showing us why he is so much at ease working in sonata form. Like Beethoven, he is uncannily good at working with tiny cells or motifs, which are going to be highly malleable and on which he will be able to apply his considerable contrapuntal science. This kind of writing also illustrates well one of the main interpretative challenges when playing Medtner. On the one hand, one has to make clear the rather dense polyphonic forest and bring out the essential, the main line. On the other, one also has to keep some awareness of such background details, which are a secondary yet necessary part of the sound world Medtner creates. In some sort of ways, one must allow the heart to reign supreme, and yet not apologize for the brain which is behind. Here this contrapuntal trick serves him very well, because it confers a much greater urgency to the second occurrence of the theme. He eventually branches out by cleverly reintroducing the night wind element into his material. I will play that whole section. At this point, I must explain that when I make a reference to the night wind, I am not talking about a specific motif. I am talking about a certain way of writing in semiquavers, which is clearly constructed as an evocation of the wind. It does not take a definite form, but it does run throughout a lot of the piece. At the point we have reached, the night wind takes over and will be the dominant force until we arrive at the second theme. I'll play it. can see here two little new motivic cells which have been introduced. It sounds as though they might just be passing, but Medtner never wastes his material, so it is better to put them on our mental map of the piece, for they will reappear, and pretty soon. One of them is simply this cell of 3 notes repeated. The other one is almost its opposite. Chromatic descending 6, rather plaintive in tone. Both are going to be important. After this, the first theme enters in a sort of playful counterpoint with the night wind. And at this point, we arrive at a transposed repetition of all the material we've just heard of the wind. I have to say that this is for me one of the very small problems I can see in the exposition of this movement. I will simply play it. It's nothing disastrous, but the power of the initial idea is slightly weakened by the repetition. Still, the music is magnificent and it doesn't last long, for we soon arrive at a small transition made up, pretty much like everything in this exposition, of 2 musical ideas, each again repeated twice. So first time, repetition, second idea, repetition. And this brings us to the final stage of this exposition of the first theme, which is restated, this time put through the mill of a chromatic ascending figure. This builds up to a point of catharsis, after which we find, in the curious rhythmic division of 2 plus 2 plus 1, the gradual emotional release of all the tension accumulated so far, entirely built up from this little cell of 3 repeated notes. At this point, it is worth noting that we are only at the end of the exposition of the first subject of the sonata. I do not think I could find another example in the literature of a sonata where so much has been put in before even reaching the second theme. Finally, to close this chapter of the work, we find once again the initial motif, which in this movement acts like a joint between the various parts of the structure. Since he is building on such a large scale, Medtner does need some pretty good and solid transition points so that we can know where we are. The eruption of this idea gives a clear signal that we are moving on to a different episode, one which will be discussed in our next video. Thanks for watching.